Wyatt, and you start learning.
Thank you, Andy, for that kind introduction. Can you all hear me well enough? Yeah. It's a pleasure to be here. I've been looking forward to this for a while, actually. I have the opportunity to share with you ideas about an alternative interpretation of the past, present, and future. Because what I'm going to talk about is how, if we were better informed about the prehistoric past and we reconnected with an ancient blueprint for civilization, we might be in a better position to face the chaos that could be approaching us now. In other words, look backwards in order to look forwards. And as a result of my talk, I hope to encourage you to develop a different perspective on civilization. And when I'm talking about civilization, what I'm talking about is life as lived in cities. It's very important to realise that. This talk is loosely based on copies of my book, copies of which I have with me. But I'm going to go through it quite fast, so if you miss anything, do take a copy of the book. So in order to help you develop this different perspective over the next hour, I'm going to focus on three main points. The first point about the origins of cities, and the fallacy that cities arose from a farming experiment over 7,000 years ago. And if you can accept that there might be another explanation for how those first cities appeared suddenly in Mesopotamia, then you might be more open to my explanation of the shamanic origins of cities. And when I'm going to talk about that, I'm also going to include confirmation of this archetype from an unexpected source, which I don't think anybody else has spotted. And so in discussing the shamanic origins, I hope to reveal some of the truth about esotericism, about hidden secret knowledge. And that leads me to possibly my most controversial point I want to make, the third point, which is about the state of secret knowledge today, and how, in my view, the powers that be actually know nothing. But first of all, what I want to do is take us right back to the beginning, as it were, more than 10,000 years ago, back to the end of the Ice Age. And more particularly, this map, you can see the dotted line is the extent of the ice. The double line around the coast is where there was the lower level of sea. Sea levels had gone down because the ice absorbed so much water, as it were. And in particular, where I want to talk about is this area, the upper Euphrates, because it's here, the Golden Crescent. In the Golden Crescent, there's the earliest evidence of everything, the earliest evidence of farming, metalwork, earliest pottery, the first signs of civilization, but no cities as such. And you can read about it in the British Museum. Paleolithic man, instead of sitting in his cave, he begins to throw seeds around somewhere at this point on the upper Euphrates, because it's here that the first domesticated seeds have been found. And miraculously, he finds there's a surplus of crop, being clever, decides to exchange it for something else, and hey presto, we as primitive people are on our way to becoming civilized, with towns and cities growing out of only marketplaces. That's the kind of conventional mainstream interpretation of what is supposed to have happened here. But in my view, unfortunately, we've been telling ourselves the wrong story. There was no farming experiment. So I'm going to very quickly go through some points about what the prehistoric record actually shows and examine the evidence a little more closely. For a start, there were people called Natufians who were around from 12,500 BC onward, and they cultivated wild seeds for 3,000 years. And during that time, there was no change from wild to domestic. Now I should explain what I mean by domesticated cereal. Here we have a typical barley head, and what the red arrow is pointing at, something called the rachis. Now the rachis is like a hinge, and what it does is it holds the seed head to the stalk. And in the wild, this seed head, this rachis, is brittle, and as soon as the seed head is ripe, it breaks, it scatters on the wind. And what the domesticated version does is wait. It waits to be picked. So the difference between domestic and wild isn't a question of taste, it's a question of convenience. It's the difference of a single gene. And the chances of a rare genetic mutant wild cereal turning into a domesticated one have been calculated by, I should point out that nearly all of my material is from mainstream sources. It's from well-established, well-respected academics and researchers. And this is Professor Gordon Hillman, who has calculated that the chances of a rare genetic mutant wild cereal turning into a domesticated one is in 2 to 4 million seed heads. It's such a low probability. And so what he's worked out is for this change to occur naturally, it could take 20 to 30 cycles by the time you had enough. So that could be 20 to 30 years. And Gordon Hillman makes the assumption, without any evidence to prove it, that women chose to pick these non-brittle seed heads. But on such a low probability, why would they make a distinction? They're gathering food. They would gather them all. No one is going to wait around for that kind of experiment to work. They will return to trapping and say, Dad, you can forget your farming experiment. It's just not realistic. So in my view, the change must have been instant. And it's not possible to suggest it was an evolutionary event, because evolutionary stuff takes hundreds and thousands of years. And the other point that's overlooked is where this change takes place. It does not make sense that it happens again and again in places which are not obvious for farming, because what I haven't made clear is that the Golden Crescent, from the Taurus range in the west, this point here, to the Zagros in the east, is almost entirely mountainous. And comments of archaeologists who've done work around here, there's a point by Mosul, in the Mosul-Sinjar region. She writes, singularly uninviting, that's her comment about farming found there. Another site in the Upper Zab, which is marked on there. Another man's written, not really suitable for farming, yet plentiful evidence. So it begs the question, what were they doing in mountains? I'm going to come back to this point. And how did the move to cities occur? Because no cities appear in these mountainous regions. Instead, they appear much further south, 4,000 years later, at about 5000 BC, at least the first cities that we know about. And this is what was referred to as Mesopotamia or Sumer. At Eridu, down, it's not marked on the map, but Eridu down in that circle, there's an excavation dating from 2000 BC, and underneath it is evidence of 17 previous layers, which go back to possibly 5000 BC or before. And we know these are cities because they have recognisable infrastructure of a city, as well as evidence of temples and administrative activity. Eridu is typical, highly organised, planned urban layout, architecture, pictographic script, cylinder seals. And what we tell ourselves is that this move to live in cities occurred because of another change in farming. And it's around this time that something else happened, another event horizon that the prehistorians call the secondary products revolution. And what this important development meant was, instead of penning up wild animals for meat and hides, which Neolithic man had been doing for thousands of years, suddenly an auroch, the precursor to a cow, and this is a genetically reconstructed male version of aurochs because they don't really exist anymore, became docile enough and changed physically for us to take milk from the female to make the secondary products of cheese and butter. A sheep, before this, sheep had coats like deer, but now, after 5000 BC, suddenly they have wool. And the onager, it had been thought that was the precursor to the donkey and the domestic equid of the Sumerians, but then they found that the onager can't be tamed. So they were hunted and kept for crossbreeding with domestic equids, which begs the question, well, where did the domestic equid come from? Perhaps that was the tarpan, the early horse. Now, the tarpan, this early horse, is very relevant to this story in lots of ways. I'm going to come back to that. So what we say to ourselves is that these changes in animals permitted the development of cities because farming with them gave people more time to do something. But in my opinion, it's the other way around, and that these changes were deliberate. The shift from hunter-gatherer to Bronze Age city dweller must have been deliberate because A, no self-respecting hunter-gatherer would rely on others for food production, because in a hunter-gatherer tribe, everybody goes out and does something to do with food. At least you wouldn't do it until you had a useful skill for city life, because it's all about delegation living in the city. Someone else does other things. And C, farming is a different skill set. Farming skills have to be taught. It's not natural. Try it. I've tried it, and I failed dismally. The hunter-gatherer was not used to staying in one place. He followed the herd. He was more used to killing than keeping stock alive, especially through the winter. It's a completely different skill set, which requires knowledge of soil and calendar. And also, wherever Bronze Age farming appears in the record, it did not involve a transition from hunter-gatherer to pastoralist. There was no switching from hunting herds to herding herds. The change in farming always involves a settled pattern first, and that's evidenced by the presence of pigs, because you can't herd them over long distances. So in my view, the earliest Bronze Age farmers were not necessarily hunter-gatherers who took up farming because of some environmental change or other external pressure, but were actually a different people with a different knowledge base, and the only plausible reason for the relative speed in the change from wild to domestic cereals, and change in the animals, was that someone knew how to interfere genetically with them. And what reinforces my view is that the first evidence of a city's existence isn't a marketplace, but a shrine. The site at Eridu has 17 layers of temple under the one excavated dating to 2000 BC. And others such as Jaquetta Hawkes have commented that the key group of people who enrolled in cities from the start are not farmers, but priests. And cities did not develop out of farming, but arrived as pre-planned artificial constructs on the landscape linked to an elite who might have looked something like this. A priestly caste, possibly a race of no known origin, an advanced people. Now I should say, I don't personally buy into the views of someone like Zecharia Sitchin, because I do believe that there's benign and positive aspects to this. And this quote from the Hermetica, I think, gives you some idea of how they saw the founders of civilization as peaceful lawgivers. It says, Artem, the fabricator of the cosmos, graced the earth for a little time with our great father Osiris and great goddess Isis, that they might give us the help we so much needed. They brought humanity divine religion and stopped the savagery of mutual slaughter. They consecrated temples and gave the gifts of food and shelter. Having learnt Artem's secret laws, they became lawgivers to humankind and so filled the world with justice. And that wherever Bronze Age city cultures appeared, in Mesopotamia, Egypt, Phoenicia, Minoan Crete, the Indus Valley, Central and Southern America, possibly China, the priestly elite knew how to access the same archetype of civilization, which is why the same principles appear in all these places, even though separated in time and space. Now, the Egyptians called it living in Ma'at, living in truth, the goddess Ma'at having the feather of truth. But I prefer to call it the concept of civilization, which in this context doesn't just mean the famous city which Sir Leonard Woolley excavated in the 1920s in southern Iraq. He claimed that was the Ur of Abraham, the Ur of the Chaldees, but I think that's somewhere else, and I'll come back to that point later. I think that was in the northern Euphrates. Ur in this context has the meaning of foundation, and it can be found in names like Jerusalem, which means Urushalem, foundation of peace. And to give you some more idea of this concept, I'm going to describe it with the help of a colour wheel plus white. So this archetype is based on all the usual attributes we describe to civilized living: straightness, accuracy, precision, balance, design, infrastructure, organisation. And there are relationships across the wheel. So we have already mentioned something to do with animals, but organised agriculture in terms of arable production. The individual cared for through the art of cooking, cuisine, and the link between food and medicine. And all forms of communication, travel, and education. Traders needed to be educated about navigation and travel. The word geometry, after all, means earth measurement. They knew the earth was round. There's the evidence of ancient maps like the Piri-Reis map, curvature of the earth. This is a mapping skill that wasn't rediscovered until the 16th century. Straight roads, we tend to think of them as Roman, but the idea is completely independent of the Romans. In Peru, the Nazca lines you have, the accuracy of them is so incredible. A 1968 National Geographic survey found that the deviation in the lines was less than 4 yards in a mile. And Thoth, or Hermes, or Mercury, is very much a symbol of the, with his winged sandals. You can find Hermes along ancient routes. And Hermes as Thoth was also credited with the invention of writing. Education is very much a characteristic. I'm going to run through all the little characteristics of this archetype. We still regard the ability to read and write as a characteristic that distinguishes civilized from uncivilized societies. In Egypt, they had these special houses of life where they were dedicated to medicine and mathematics and so forth. And Hermes and the caduceus are the link with the next segment, because his symbol, the caduceus, is still used in medical things today. And the basic instruments didn't change for thousands of years. You can see in Egypt, that's not very clear, but anyway, you can see in Egypt that these instruments were the same thousands of years ago. And there was no split, as there is today, between physical and mental illness. They understood the psyche, the importance of healing the mind as well as the body, and the importance of diet and the whole thing. I've already mentioned about animals. The point about the animals is that they change physically, they become smaller, as well as something goes in their head, something changes in their head. So it's about docility and convenience. And they don't just become farm animals or even just pets, but they also, like horses, become instruments of policy as war horses, which links to government. And here we have very much the characteristics of civilization. This is very much what you can find in all parts of the world, these same principles. If they'd have grown organically, they'd be random, these marketplaces, but they're laid out as either gridiron or quartering or circular. Things like Sheshet in here, she's the mistress of measure. She's an Egyptian deity. She has a 7-pointed thing on her head which is meant to be helped with sighting lines for laying things out. The golden section, phi, pi, are very critical to architecture. And the plumb bob, I have personally seen plumb bobs in the museums in Luxor in Egypt and in Delhi where the Indus Valley stuff. So whatever they built, straightness was absolutely fundamental, regardless of the size of the blocks, which could weigh many tons. The Sumerian Epic of Gilgamesh talks about the walls of Uruk being as straight as an architect's string. And also, what is fundamental to a city is the ruler, right order, justice, and the rule of law, which links to trade. It's very interesting, we have for justice the same weighing symbol, the weighing machine balanced there. And there have been amazing routes of trade over the years. What I've highlighted here in the middle of the Euphrates is a place called Mari. It's about 4,000 years old. In 1933, when the French were excavating it, they found this 300-room palace, and you can see a scale model of that in the Louvre in Paris. And in this palace, in the ruins of this palace, they found documents that are also nearly 4,000 years old, relating to tin, being for a man from Crete who was he's an agent based in a Phoenician city, and this tin may have come all the way from Afghanistan and traded on at Mari before being sent on to the Phoenician trading ports which are on the coast there. So civilized trade is about a legal framework, it's about mutual agreement, it's the law of contract, because otherwise what you're talking about is the seizing of booty as a consequence of warfare or piracy. And the Phoenicians were the traders par excellence. And it's through trade that of course, you can develop a cuisine, because then you can bring in all the spices. And this is the beginning of the great cuisines of the world. And the Egyptians were not alone in bringing up food products from spices and such like from elsewhere. Also, in cities now you start to find food cooked on a significant scale, organised cooking such as breweries and bakeries. This photograph here is of the pyramid workers' village, the ones who worked on building, there's been an excavation of those who worked on building the Great Pyramid in Egypt. And cities can only survive if they have a supply of fresh food from the countryside, so you need highly organised agriculture. And the farmer has to look after his soil. He can't just keep randomly moving in that nomadic way. So the way to control water is absolutely essential to his success. So you do find terracing, you do find different kinds of dikes and ditching and irrigation. And the farmer then also relies very much on the priestly caste, because he needs to know what the seasons are doing, what the weather patterns is. And so many of the ancient gods have this vegetative seasonal aspect to them. They die in the winter and they're born again in the spring. So the priests are the ones who, the physical temples in the centre, they hold everything together. But in spite of their central role in the creation of civilization, much of their work and much of their knowledge must have remained secret. Especially that knowledge to do with the foundation of cities, and I'm going to talk about that in a little while, because what we don't see is we don't see cities growing out of Mesopotamia to begin with. It's all about elites that stay put. And I'm going to come back to discussing the all-important priest-king relationship. But now I'm going to discuss with you, show you, this surprising evidence that I think confirms much of what I've just described to you. And it's contact between the civilizers and a group of tribes which I think not only confirms the existence of the whole blueprint, but also shows that the knowledge of how to found it was not available to everyone. It was not part of humanity's inevitable progress. Because this particular group of tribes who became aware of certain things didn't change how they lived. They carried on living in mud huts for several thousands of years, even though they picked up ideas and techniques. And the people I'm talking about are possibly the ancestors of some of us in this room, our very own Indo-European ancestors. And what's extraordinary about this piece of information I'm going to give you is that in itself it dates back more than 5,000 years. And that is also an extraordinary fact. And by Indo-European, what I mean are the people who spoke these languages. So it includes the Celts, it includes the Greeks, the Romans, the Latin speakers, Tokharians, Slavs. It does not include Hungarians. They're physically quite close to the other Indo-Europeans, but they have a different linguistic base, and it doesn't include the Basques, who they came across later. So these little linguistic islands of Basque and Hungarians prove that these links between the European languages are more than just a coincidence. And it does include Iranians, Persians, and it does include Indians. Now, I don't know how many of you know that it was discovered in the 19th century, these links, because they realised that although Sanskrit was a different alphabet, when you actually analysed it, it had the same roots as the other European languages. And that's how they worked out that once upon a time, these people must have lived together. Now, when we become aware of them is in the Iron Age, which is much later, about 1200 BC onwards, particularly the Celts, the Greeks and the Romans. That's when we know about them. But when they last lived together was in the Bronze Age, and that's over 5,000 years ago, before 3100 BC, because that's when they split up. And this is thousands of years before any of them actually lived in cities, and where we lived was neither in India nor in Europe, but here in Ukraine. And this is something I've worked out for myself. And there's lots of factors which I won't go into, but they're all in the book. And my findings are now being confirmed by a genetics expert, Dr. Spencer Wells, who published his data in 2004. He runs a genographic project funded by the National Geographic magazine. And if that doesn't resonate with some of you, and you feel that your roots are in Europe and not in the Ukraine, let me explain why. Because you may be resonating with this map, the first map that I put up. And this is the Ice Age map. And what those little dots are, these ones here, all around here, these little dots, they are all clans that an Oxford geneticist called Professor Brian Sykes, who has given me permission to reproduce this map, and he's worked out that the mitochondrial DNA on the maternal side, going back, he can identify where it originates, and he goes back, they all vary in time, but it goes back at least 45,000 years. 17,000, 22,000, all different ages. And that's an extraordinary thought, because your mothers, some of your mothers, were already here during the Ice Age. And what this means is that your fathers came from the Ukraine. They were the male warrior invaders. That's where the Indo-Europeans come. Anyway, coming back to my point about contact between Indo-Europeans and civilizers, people haven't spotted this. Mainly because these people didn't start to live in cities. So how do I know? Well, partly through an analysis of language, and I'll give you some examples. So you've got Mesopotamia down here, you've got the Ukraine up there, Black Sea, Turkey. This is modern day Turkey, this is modern day Greece, and this is Iraq here. Consider the word for red. Is it just a coincidence that the Sumerian word for copper so closely resembles the Indo-European word for copper and our word for red? If you take the Indo-Europeans' knowledge of metallurgy, now they had words for bronze and copper, but they had no word for tin. Tin is completely absent from their vocabulary. And if you know about bronze, you'll know that you need tin to mix with copper, because it's an alloy of the two. So what that suggests is that they were given the bronze from somebody, I think, from the elites, the civilized people. They also had words to do with farming and stock keeping, and we find all these words: grain, sow, plough, sickle, and they knew about stock breeding sheep and cattle. But most significantly of all, they clearly benefited from the secondary products revolution because they knew about butter and cheese. And another of our common root words that goes back 5,000 years is a word that reconstructs to a common Indo-European word for king, which is reg. So you find rex in Latin, rix in Celtic, raj in Indian, Reich in German. And the basis for all of this, so let's go back then. The basis for all of this is to do with accurate measurement. In English we have this word ruler, which means the king and the measuring stick. We've got that confusion between the two. So when the linguists look at this, they think, this is very odd, there must have been two kings. One that did all the measuring and was clearly a civilized kind of king, and the other one was warlike, because we were warlike tribes. But in my view, it's a straight lift from that Bronze Age city type, archetype that I showed you earlier. And at the time of this contact, we were warlike tribes living in mud huts, fortified settlements that may have looked a bit like this, where the central focus was the hearth. We did not build cities for thousands of years after this contact. So the question you should be asking yourself is why? Why would the civilizers bother with these warlike tribes in mud huts? And there's a very good reason why they should want to make contact with them, and the simple answer is the tarpan, the wild horse. And that's because the Indo-Europeans lived in the range of the wild horse. The first domesticated horse bones have been found at this place, Sredny Stolp, on the Dnieper River. And they're at least 4000 BC. The first wheeled carts don't appear on the steppes north of the Black Sea and the Caspian until about 3000 BC. And the civilizers would have brought horses down from the Ukraine, but it's a little longer before they made an obvious impact. By 2800 BC, 80% of Sumerians living down here lived in cities and had wheeled carts. So in my view, until the arrival of the civilizers, people who knew how to genetically interfere deliberately with animals, the tarpan, the wild horse, had been of little use to the Indo-Europeans. They had lived with wild horses for thousands of years, penning them up from eaten hides. They weren't able to ride them or drive them. And the idea that the Indo-Europeans invented the wheel, or any of the rest of it, in my view, is nonsense. Because it's only after domestication and after the civilizers, I think, gave them the wheel that the horse suddenly becomes useful. So the Indo-Europeans, I think, picked up techniques and words such as the one for king, and there's other examples I won't go into now, that we did not understand the full meaning of, because we came into contact with the civilized people who did live in cities, and for whom these things did have meaning, and who knew about wheels. And what's also fascinating is that this contact gets fixed in time, because it gets fixed to before 3000, because in 359 BC, there's a massive environmental catastrophe. There's a huge thing that happens, and everybody goes on the move. And what's significant about this date, for those of you who follow such things, it's quite close to the Mayan long count calendar date, which is supposed to end this year in December. And nobody seems to know what was the cause of this catastrophe. It could have been a comet, it could have been, who knows, that caused rivers to shift. Personally, I think this may have been the Great Flood. And what it meant was that there was a massive change in climate. There was a change from the Holocene climatic optimum, where there had been warmer temperatures in the northern hemisphere during the summer, cooler summers in the tropics. I mean, like a real Garden of Eden. And there had been extensive forests and high rainfall in areas that went on to become deserts, such as the Gobi and the Thar. The Sahara had been a green savanna with giraffe and other wildlife roaming in. All these places then dramatically become deserts. And it's at the end of this that there are these huge migrations as everyone goes looking for new and safer homelands. Now the Celts, they're the most interesting because they go the furthest. They go the furthest west, they end up in Ireland. Toponyms, place names, all the way across here, all these place names of rivers are Celtic derivations from Danube, Dnieper, Dniester, Danube, Danube. It shows you the routes that they took. And they also went far to the east. You can't see it very clearly, but, and you mustn't laugh, because they ended up in the Chinese desert, well, it became the Chinese Taklamakan desert, and they have found 4,000-year-old, 6-foot-tall, ginger-haired mummies wearing tartan. I mean, you couldn't make it up, could you? But it's true. Anyway, the Greeks and the Romans, they went down through the Caucasus, and they came down through that route. And the Indians and the Iranians, they came through this route and ended up, the Indians in northeast India. in the Indus Valley several thousands of years. And if any of you are still very attached to Celts and thinking they're somehow indigenous, I put in this map to show you that 1000 BC, the Celts had only, they're only just beginning to arrive in England. They are not indigenous, much as we all love them. And civilizers, they got to their new homes much sooner than the Indo-Europeans because they went by sea. They were a little bit more advanced. They had knowledge of longitude as well as latitude. So civilization does spread at this point. It does spread to Mesopotamia. It spreads to the Indus Valley here. David Roll is one of those who thinks that they come down and round and up in through the eastern desert, and then come the Egyptians and do a deal with the Phoenicians, who take up residence there, Minoan Cretes, and the Etruscans in Italy. And it wouldn't surprise me to learn that the civilizers were returning to Egypt the first time, the Zep Tepi, what Gujarev referred to as pre-sand Egypt, and that they were repairing structures like the Sphinx and the pyramids. Some of you may know of the work of geologist Robert Schoch, who's dated the Sphinx to a much earlier time, because he says to that Holocene time, because that's when the Nabtium pluvial was happening, and that's the rainfall that caused the vertical erosion that's seen on the body of the Sphinx. But because the Indo-Europeans had split up into their individual tribes, the civilizers no longer had any common impact on them, because they're now thousands of miles apart. So bits of knowledge get stuck with certain tribes, particularly the Celts. And it means that when the Indo-Europeans come across the civilizers again, certain concepts are familiar. And the Celts are the most interesting. And it's possible that they even knew about certain gods. In particular, they may have known about Thoth. At a time such as late as the 1st century AD, the Greeks and Romans had changed Thoth to Hermes, or Mercury. And Hermes, or Mercury, is in itself interesting, because it possibly means Urmes, and that word Ur again. And in this case, it could mean son of the foundation, Mes meaning son. And at this time, in the 1st century AD, the Celts are still calling Thoth by an archaic name of Titates. Now the implication of this, because you've got to remember the Celts are far to the west, so they kind of got stuck. So archaic knowledge could have remained with them. And the implication of that is that maybe they knew about these gods from before dynastic Egypt started, from before 3159 BC. But in spite of the close proximity of the Indo-Europeans to the civilizers, they didn't know about the more metaphysical secrets of civilization. They didn't know about other aspects of Thoth, in particular his relationship to cosmic vibration, because another of his names was Jehuti. As Jehuti, Thoth was the originator of sound, or vibration, sets all matter into motion, because his name Jehuti links to the Jed, and the symbol of the Jed pillar. And this, according to one writer, is a symbol of cosmic vibration, animating all matter, bringing it to life. And it's a fundamental resonance. In the Hermetica, it talks about the word, Artem's word, falling on calming the chaotic waters and making them pregnant with all forms. So what is really fascinating here are the links between the Jed, vibration, and a significant feature of civilization, which I mentioned earlier, the sacred mound. Now in Egypt and other parts of the world, this takes the form of the pyramid, or ziggurat, in Mesopotamia. But I'm going to talk about Egypt now. And there are similar rituals which take place inside ziggurats and inside pyramids in Mesopotamia and Central America. But just using Egypt as the example. So if you look at the internal arrangement, many of you are probably familiar with the work of Chris Dunn, Giza's power plant. And I'm not saying that Chris is wrong about the pyramid, I'm just saying it has different functions. He's talking about it being able to generate power, electricity, but they didn't have toasters and the need for massive amounts of electricity like we do. So what I think he overlooks is the importance of metaphysical ritual, and I think that was one of the primary purposes of pyramids. There's other functions too, as scalar waves, and actually you ought to try and get Alexander Putney to live stream to give you a talk. Hey, if you look at, if you focus on the King's Chamber, and you can see there's enormous effort was made to bring these incredible slabs, 50 tons, 500 miles to the quarry in Aswan, and the way the chamber's constructed is deliberately so that it can vibrate. Things are not tied down. And in these, what they call the relieving chambers, there's deliberately gouges taken out of them, possibly to fine-tune for resonance. Graham Hancock is one of those who's compared the symbolism of the king's chamber with the jed pillar to do with vibration, which is kind of interesting comparison. And they didn't do it because they were building tombs, or not for dead pharaohs anyway, but because pyramids played an important role in shamanic ritual. So I'm now going to explain that very important priest-king relationship, the Melchizedek. Now, Melchizedek is an interesting word because it means king, priest. Melch is a word for king, and Zadok is a word for priest. So I'm just going to go into a little bit more detail about metaphysics and the relationship with the spirit world. Because fundamental to their understanding of metaphysics was this concept of cosmic sympathy. And the Ur-Hekau priest, who's this guy who's got twin serpents, he told me. He's sometimes called a magician, but he's responsible for channeling a Heka fluence. Because they had this idea that if you could interfere below, you could change things above. There was a complete dialogue going on, and that you could affect change on the higher metaphysical plane. And it's a dynamic dialogue. And in so doing, you interfere with a natural order to create civilization. But what was key was to have an earthly representative who was trained to engage with the spirit world on behalf of society. That's where the king bit comes in. And what I'm talking about here is divine R-I-T-E, not R-I-G-H-T, not divine right, as in political right. And how this applies to the original archetype is it's the role of the king as the earthly representative to undertake a special journey on behalf of his people. And this is the shamanic role of the ruler. And I'm going to just briefly explain what I mean by shaman. These are sort of people we normally think of as shaman. And they are people who know how to have an out-of-body experience, who are able to journey as a spirit on behalf of a person or their community to get answers. And it's important to understand that the information that they obtain is not discoverable through experimentation. And the initiation and training of the shaman is very critical from an early age because these shamanic journeys are dangerous, frightening. They're near-death experiences that can result in the actual death of the shaman. And also the preparation of the substance that brings on a trance is key to the whole process. So these are what we normally talk about as shaman: wild, elemental, powerful, anthropological curiosities, Mongolian steppes, Peruvian jungle. We don't think of this as a shaman. But in my view, the sophisticated rulers, the people who created cities, were shaman. And I'm going to explain to you what the parallels are. It's just that they use different methods. Otherwise, they're all linked. They have as much in common with their Peruvian and Mongolian counterparts, just we haven't realised it. And they were all trained, they were all initiated into secret rituals, which involved the ability to astral plane, to have out-of-body experiences, while still alive, in order to access knowledge that helped keep the whole concept of civilization on track. Indeed, the very word pharaoh is possibly a Greek corruption of these words, the per ur. Again, this word ur comes up, and what it means in this context is the house of foundation, per meaning house. And this was the place where the pharaoh's initiation took place. So the Greeks are confusing his name with his role, which is interesting. And its place at Nekhen is where the pharaoh went to be initiated. It was a mysterious fort which had no defensive purposes. And what the pharaoh trained for here was a highly important festival which only happened every 40 years. It's referred to his Jubilee, or his Hebsed festival. And this Saqqara is a typical place. Citizens came from all over Egypt to this festival, and the purpose of it was to rededicate the country to civilization, to acknowledge the sacred foundation of cities. And it took place in a purpose-built courtyard. This is the Hebsed festival courtyard here, and with a deliberately built pyramid. Saqqara is just typical, but they were all over Egypt. And what happened during this was something called the Osirian rites. And the Osirian rites are the reenactment of the death of the god Osiris and his revival at the hands of his wife Isis. So there are public aspects to this festival and secret aspects. In the public aspects, the pharaoh wears a special bull kilt and he runs around the courtyard. He also participates in a ritual meal called the Hetep. And after this meal, he disappears into the secret part of the festival, which takes place inside the pyramid, into the realm of the deity Sokar. Now, it's our cultural problem that when we think of pyramids, we think of death. in tombs, but the Egyptian word for pyramid is mur, M-R, which has the idea of instrument for ascending, not a tomb. And the realm of Sokar is in itself interesting because of what he represents. He's a triple manifestation of the gods Ta, Sokar, and Osiris. And these gods represent the triple powers of animation, incarnation, and restoration. And so they're essential to cycles of life and death, the soul being immortal and reincarnated in a living body. And what the pharaoh did when he entered the realm of Sokar in the painting was either lay on a bed, and this is a typical bed, a Hebsed festal bed. It's covered in gold leaf, gold being a good conductor of electricity. And you can see Tutankhamun's golden Hebsed festal bed in the Cairo Museum. Or he lay in a sarcophagus of alabaster or granite, as in the King's Chamber, which, as I said before, was designed to vibrate and create an electrical field. And before doing this, the pharaoh put on something called the Keni garment over his chest, and he participated in the Wyatt, opening of the mouth ceremony. Now, in my view, the Keni garment, maybe, which was called the embrace of Osiris, perhaps that was to protect his heart from the electrical field. And I also think that the opening of the mouth ceremony was done to stop him from swallowing his tongue, because he may have been having like an epileptic type fit. And what confirms my suspicions that this was all part of a shamanic ritual are the pyramid texts, the coffin texts. And these were discovered at Saqqara in the 19th century by Flinders Petrie, the Victorian archaeologist. Again, our culture problem. Because they describe the journey of the pharaoh's soul, we think of it as being after death, but it is more likely that they describe his soul's journey in life. And the Egyptians themselves call these texts the Book of Coming Out by Day, not a reference to death. Dr. Jeremy Nader, an Oxford academic, is one of the few who has come to this conclusion. He has pointed out in his book how these texts are full of shamanic language that is found typically among shaman all over the world. They frequently refer to the pharaoh taking on the form of a bird, or flying up, or climbing a ladder. Chapter 20, for example, talks of the pharaoh rising into the sky like a mighty hawk. Other texts refer to a stairway to the sky, which is set up for me that I may ascend on it to the sky. I ascend on the smoke of the great sensing. I fly up as a bird. Elsewhere, the same text referred to the pharaoh flying up in the form of a falcon to the imperishable northern stars. And we're going to come back to that point. It's a really important point. But first I'm going to explain just quickly the Egyptian concept of the soul. And what he was attempting to do during this shamanic ritual was unite different aspects of his soul. The Egyptians had this concept of auras and different etheric layers. And one of them was called the Ka, which is symbolised by the hieroglyph of the upraised arms, as you can see above this pharaoh's head. And this is the layered soul which corresponds to what we call the aura. They saw it as the vehicle transmitting vitality between the spiritual and material bodies, and it's considered immortal. So the pharaoh is trying to unite his Ka with his Ba. The Ba is a little bird, and this is what we would call the soul, and it's an aspect of the astral body. It needs the Ka in order to inhabit a body, but it can leave the body while it's still alive. So it's the thing that goes travelling while you're asleep. And so what the pharaoh wanted to do is unite his Ka and his Ba to become an ark, a shining light, a hero, which is sometimes referred to as the phoenix, which is a Greek word, so he could communicate with his ancestor spirits. Now, just an interesting connection between phoenix, which is the Greek word, which is linked to fire, we all know about phoenixes and ashes, and pyramid, which is another Greek word, which also has a root word for fire. But, as I've said earlier, the Egyptian word is mur, instrument for ascending. And this is just a little bit of fun that I've done. Yeah. So if you join mur, Ka, Ba, I don't know if any of you kind of get this, but yeah. Anyway, I'm just swiftly moving on. And where the pharaoh was astral planed to in his Merkaba were the imperishable northern stars. Now, what's so interesting about the Egyptian word for these imperishable northern stars is they're called the Kemi. In my view, is this the true meaning of alchemy? We've maybe been completely misled about alchemy. We've been told that alchemy comes from this word Kem, which means the black lands. I think they missed the point. They missed it, and it makes more sense that Kemi actually means the fixed stars. The journey. This is where the pharaoh is going, because we have to realise that what we know about Egypt we learned through the Greeks. So if the Greeks didn't understand something or were denied access to the knowledge of it, then we get faulty information, and it's probable that they didn't know about the astral plane of the chemi, but what they may have known about was the substance that the pharaoh consumed first. So they may have confused a process with an outcome. As a result, we know about the process without being aware of its purpose, and that process is what we call alchemy. So in my view, I'm going to expand this a bit later. That's why I don't think that the powers that be know anything, because I think they're as ignorant as we are. And I think it's the Egyptians who stopped their secrets from being known. So alchemy, this is how we normally interpret alchemy, but maybe it isn't even the transformation of another metal into gold. Maybe it's the combining of a substance with purified gold for ritual purposes. There is a view that the philosopher's stone, which is the goal of alchemy, to create the philosopher's stone, is a powder. Writer Lawrence Gardner, who you may all be familiar with, he writes about electrical processes and the production of monatomic gold, a white powder with levitational properties. Now, how this fits in with the Hebsed festival concerns the Hetep ritual meal. And was the Hetep ritual meal the means by which the pharaoh brought on the trance? Because a significant element of the Hetep meal was the solar bread. And there are references to the solar bread in the pyramid text. One pyramid text talks about it as an utterance for the offering bread to fly up. So what was it? It clearly had special properties. And what I did is I explored the links between the solar bread and the cow goddess Hathor. Now the cow goddess Hathor had many roles, mostly to do with nurturing, and she's sometimes attributed as lending her cow horns, you can see her cow horns here, on her head here, to Isis when Isis is tending the infant Horus, but they actually belong to Hathor. And she's also the one who nurtures the soul of the pharaoh on his journey. And she had other names like Nubten, Golden One. And if you go to her temple at Dendra on the Nile, you can find on the back wall, on the outside of the back wall, I've seen it myself, the hieroglyph for gold. And it's at Dendra that you have in the crypt the extraordinary pictures that look like carvings, the release of like light bulbs. And this could relate to certain electrical processes, which I'm not going to go into now in my book. And even more significantly, it's at her temple at Serabit el Kharim in the Sinai Peninsula, where in the 19th century Flinders Petrie found a mysterious white powder with no animal residue, hidden in vast quantities under slabs on the floor. So was this powder that Flinders Petrie discovered at Serabit el Kharim, was this the philosopher's stone? So maybe we haven't realised that the philosopher's stone and the solar bread are the same thing, and the Egyptians used levitation properties of the white powder as their means of entering a trance, and that the Hathor temples played a part in the preparation. There's another really kind of strange piece of the jigsaw I can add here. And who was it that the pharaoh was communicating with? Is there another connection with another Indo-European root word? Who were the Nita, the Egyptian gods? Were they sometimes giant snakes? And is it just a coincidence that the Egyptian word for gods, Nita, compares with a Proto-Indo-European word for snake? This is a reconstructed word, comes out as Nita. And in English, we drop the N and it becomes Ada. And some research which is relevant here is the modern experience of Jeremy Narby, which he describes in his book, The Cosmic Serpent. In 1985, as part of his PhD in anthropology from Stanford University, he travelled to the Peruvian Amazon to study a native community called the Kirishari, and he personally undertook shamanic experiences using the ayahuasca vine. And during the course of this experience, he communicated with a pair of enormous snakes. And what struck him was the visual parallel between the image of the entwined snakes, such as in the caduceus, and that of the double helix. Is this the reason that Thoth, aka Hermes, is associated with twin snakes and the caduceus? He came to the fascinating conclusion that the parallel was more than visual, it was actual. Shaman, he concluded, were communicating at the level of molecular biology, of DNA itself. And he was really surprised to discover in the technical literature that the shape of the double helix of DNA is most often described as a ladder or a spiral staircase, which compares with those worldwide frequent references made to climbing a ladder during a shamanic trance. And Narby thus discovered how native people acquired knowledge of medicinal plants. Plants that are so toxic and require special preparation, you have no chance to experiment with them, they kill you before you do. So you need to know. And that's how you find out, is through this shamanic means. So they knew precisely which plants to choose out of 80,000 Amazonian plant species. And that was through shamanic ritual. So what I'm concluding is that the pharaohs of ancient Egypt were doing something much more sophisticated than the Peruvian jungle ones, but it's still on the same principles. And knowing the importance of gold to the whole process explains why civilization appears to start in the mountains. That's where the gold is. And the extraordinary thing is, Mesopotamia had no gold reserves itself, but its ancient name, Mesopotamia is the Greek name, which means just between the rivers. The actual name that the Sumerians gave it was Ki-Ng, and that translates as land where gold is king, because their gold came from the aptly named Golden Crescent. I had a strange hair standing in the back of my neck when I realised that places like Hamadan, for example, where the earliest pottery has been discovered, is on ancient gold routes. Again and again and again, there's references to gold, toponyms, mines, whatever it is. It's all in that area. So civilizations is about more than sewage and straight roads. There's this esoteric aspect to it, which we are largely ignorant. And we haven't understood that the ancients had esoteric, special spiritual experiences using alchemy to astral plane, not because they were working on themselves to become enlightened beings. They were already enlightened beings. They underwent these experiences on behalf of their communities to gain practical and useful knowledge to keep civilization on track. Because they understood that the divine manifests through all forms of energy. They understood that it manifests through the plant kingdom. So they worked out how to genetically modify it so you can use those special properties for convenience, for healing, for food and fuel. They knew that animals are another manifestation of the divine, that wild animals come from a very pure source, unaffected by humans. But you can't get that close to them. They knew that animals have souls too, but they understood how to adapt animal energy, domesticating it in a kind way, not in a cruel way, and develop them as spiritual companions so they can become pets. And they also knew how to work with earth energies, sacred geometry and geodesy, and using gold and semi-precious stones. I was fascinated to discover I never fully understood the role of lapis lazuli. All lapis lazuli comes from Afghanistan, and there was an exhibition at the British Museum not long ago, the treasures from Afghanistan, and they actually showed that in these ancient cities in Mesopotamia in Sumer, there was actually little bits of lapis lazuli from Afghanistan. Why? I'd really be fascinated to know that. But above all, their goal was to live in truth, peace and harmony, because civilization is about more than physical cities. It's about a way of life, a way of thinking, a philosophy that connects everything. And we haven't appreciated that those gifts of domestication were gifts, and it weren't the result of natural change. So what happened to it all? Where did it all go wrong? Very quickly, just going to run through this so fast. Timeline of decline of Egypt. From 1200 BC on, what you have now is a shift from Bronze Age to Iron Age. 600 BC, Egypt's starting to become vulnerable to invasion. This is when the Persians first invade. They know the writings on the wall. Egypt starts to decide to open up. The Egyptians decide to start teaching the Greeks things. This is why the Greeks suddenly know everything. Mathematics, geometry, geography, medicine. Pythagoras is reckoned to have spent 22 years living in Egyptian temples being taught. So when Alexander the Great arrives in 333 BC, he's unusual in being a conqueror who invaded because he loved Egypt. And he created a great library at Alexandria in order to preserve knowledge. In the same time, the Romans were still trying to get in there, and they don't quite succeed until Antony and Cleopatra in 30 BC, by which time much of the secret knowledge had begun to disappear from Egypt. The Egyptians had no answer to the military might of the Indo-Europeans, to these iron weapons, and they didn't want their secrets to fall into the hands of the Romans. And in particular, the end really came when the Romans fell under the influence of that monotheistic religion we call Christianity in the 4th century, because it's at that point they symbolically and literally cut us off from the ancient past. In 394 AD, at the Temple of Isis, this is a picture of it here, on the island of Philae, that's when the Romano-Christians murdered the last Egyptian priests, and it's after that we can't read any hieroglyphs until the 19th century. And it's after this that the great library at Alexandria is destroyed and the Eleusinian mysteries are closed. It's the Romans, long before they converted to Christianity, the Romans, not the Greeks or the Celts or the Persians, who were the ones responsible for plunging us into darkness. We became ignorant flat earthers who believed that the sun went round the earth. And long before the 4th century AD, the Romans were already attacking and destroying all pockets of knowledge and wisdom that they could find. This is an extraordinary thing I hadn't realised until I did the research for the book. We just think of Christian martyrdom, but actually, around the 38 AD, BC, all around that time, they were destroying, they were attacking and pushing out of Italy the Pythagoreans. They were attacking, banning alchemy. They banned all books to do with alchemy. There's a very strong view that they deliberately chose to come to Anglesey, to Mona, to destroy the Druids. That's the reason they invaded Britain. There's a lot of evidence to suggest that. The Essenes, they attacked the Essenes in Qumran and destroyed the temple in Jerusalem in AD 66. They one of the particular campaigns they fought in the centre of Turkey, in the ruins of the collapsed Hittite Empire, was to destroy the Chaldean Magi in AD 70. There's no reason, no strategic reason for this, but these are all carriers of ancient knowledge. That's the significant part. And when Emperor Constantine decides to adopt Christianity as the official religion, it's just one more effective means of achieving social mind control. And the consequence of that decision is that we lost an understanding of civilization as being based on mechanisms of karma and reincarnation. And we in the West have denied the possibility and belief in death as part of the cycle because of a Christian doctrine that in the 2nd century AD, Origen decided to introduce a concept of purgatory, that we might taste something bitter. So for us, death is a hopeless experience, implying permanent separation, and as a result we feel guilt and terrible feels of bereavement. But if we could know that this Egyptian Hall of Judgment scene, if we could know that this was actually how it could be, then we would feel so differently and we wouldn't suffer so much psychologically from depression and the constant need to escape through drink and drugs. Because here what happens is the soul is led into the hall, and there's the confession in front of the 42 gods, the 42 meter above here. And if the soul is found to be telling the truth, the soul, the heart soul, this is the heart soul of the seat of integrity of the person, and this is the feather of truth, and you're weighed against the feather of truth. And if you're found to be telling the truth, then Osiris, who sits in judgment, he will let you join the ancestors. But if you've not successfully weighed, then you are devoured here by Apophis, and the punishment is to be reincarnated so you can learn your lessons again. And that is what the Christian Church did not want us to know about. So for the last 1500 years or so, we've been living under the influence of the ego in one form or another. And I would argue that one reason we face so many problems today, whether it's environmental degradation or whatever it is too many of us continue to think like Romans, believing that the end justifies the means. In other words, that destruction caused by a new motorway or whatever justified because of the economic prosperity. And that is no different in logic from a society in which every 10th soldier can be killed in order to improve military discipline, because that's the true meaning of decimation, as was the case in ancient Rome. So what happened? I'm nearly finished. What happened to the ancient knowledge, to the original archetype? It's not surprising we knew nothing about the shamanic ritual of the pharaohs, or a holistic, spiritually based archetype of civilization. Not so much because mankind forgot the truth about alchemy or secret traditions, but because that knowledge had to be kept secret to keep it safe. Not from us, but from Romans, from Christians, from anybody who does not realise that knowledge is for peaceful purposes. And that, in my view, is why the powers that be actually know nothing. Now, the secret techniques of how to access the knowledge did not entirely die out after Egypt collapsed, but went up the trade routes, appropriately enough, to the northern Euphrates, to Haran, to around about this place where those first domesticated cereals were discovered. And it was kept alive by alchemists and people known as Sabians. This is a picture of modern-day Sabians doing some rituals in the Tigris. And they went on to influence Sufism and Islam through their guardianship of the Hermetica, the emerald tablet of the thrice-great Hermes Trismegistus. And we can see the impact of concept of civilization through Islam on the great Moorish influence in southern Spain. I've just put that picture up. That's a picture of the Alhambra, of the Generalife in Granada. And at this point, the influence of the Hermetica is limited to Islam. And it's not until the Knights Templar in the 12th century take an interest. I've used this example of the rose window from Chartres Cathedral to symbolise the Knights Templars. because then we start to reconnect with something as basic as geometry. And interestingly, the Knights Templars lead the Second Crusade deliberately to a place just south of Haran, to a place called Sanliufa or Edessa. And this, in my view, taking the work of someone like Adrian Gilbert, is the actual Ur of the Chaldees, the real city of Abraham. Because at this point they knew that Haran, which was just here, Sanliufa is just about here, they knew that Haran was where all the interesting stuff was, where the Sabians were and the other alchemists. But apart from geometry and stunning Gothic churches, the Knights Templar could not eventually overcome that power of the church. They wanted to protect knowledge from the church. They had a motto which is to will, to dare, to know, to keep silent. One man who had more success a bit later was Cosimo de' Medici. In my opinion, it was his decision to have Marsilio Ficino translate the Hermetica into Italian in the 15th century that was, I think, a stimulus for the whole Renaissance movement. And for a while, the church was diminished, but not for long. By the time of Isaac Newton in 1642, the church had resumed its stranglehold on our intellectual development. In 1600, Giordano Bruno had been burnt at the stake for his heretical beliefs in the Hermetica. In 1642, Galileo Galilei died a condemned heretic, all for knowing facts that we completely take for granted today. And I don't think it's any coincidence that the father of science, Isaac Newton, the man who discovered gravitational force, he was an alchemist. And it's through his, I think, through his work with alchemy that he actually worked out the things he did. And I think he would have got further with knowing things if the church hadn't been quite so oppressive. And it's only really with the discoveries relating to quantum physics and the realization that at a submolecular level, all is connected, that energy and matter are interchangeable, that the church, this is around about the turn of the 20th century, the church loses its battle to control knowledge. But we're still left with a legacy of the objective-subjective split, this scientific method. And even that is receding as the implications of quantum physics are realized. So in my view, the Iron Age is slowly and finally coming to an end. A new era is beginning, an era of etheric energy, of vibration, frequency, resonance, something that the ancient Egyptians and others knew about. The picture on the left is of Tesla, this one here, because I think he really did know some stuff. I've also seen it written that possibly Tesla destroyed his own stuff because he didn't think we were ready, rather than just the row with JP Morgan. And I've deliberately written C squared equals E, because the point is that energy and matter are interchangeable. It just depends at what level anything is vibrating at. So we have a choice. We can no longer live in a state of grace with wild kingdoms of nature, not enough wilderness left on the planet. We need to organise ourselves in civilised societies with systematic farming. But what is lacking from modern society is an understanding of the connection to the eternal spirit that exists at all levels. We think that we are all there is, and that only matter is ourselves, but we forget to honour the divine. So for us to survive, we need to learn to manifest through ourselves in divine spirit how we live and how we behave towards each other and the planet. Every aspect of modern society needs to reflect that. In our cities, our countryside, we are too easily distracted by materialism. And the Bronze Age civilizers knew all that, and they could honour the source and still live in comfort. So I'm going to leave you with a quote from the one Roman exception, who's one of my heroes, Marcus Aurelius. And what he says here is, constantly regard the universe as one living being, having one substance and one soul, and observe how all things have reference to one perception, the perception of this one living being, and how all things act with one movement, and how all things are cooperating causes of all things which exist. Observe too the continuous spinning of the thread and the contexture of the web. And thank you all very much for listening to me.
We're going to use flying wine, really, and maybe do a little bit more. I've asked Lucy to do a bit of a talk on maybe cover some of the religious things, because if you understand the concept that maybe the monks controlled all literature and therefore all history from the time of maybe Christ to the Gutenberg press, you know, like it's 1700 years of editing history. So I've asked And Lucy's wary of offending people, and I personally think, as I said, that all truths are personal and therefore inoffensive unless they're given a value by the other person, and that's a pity for the other person, but certainly not a response that I would have to deal with. But if you're unhappy with something, then please say, because as I said, we're not out to besmirch and do down, but at the same time, there's a historical context to some of this.
Could I ask if anybody's got any questions about the prehistoric stuff? Anyone? Is that? No.
Yeah. How far back do you think history goes then, as far as humans are concerned?
Well, what exactly do you mean by that?
Well,
I'm looking
you
at
mentioned a lot of the historical things you're looking at have a much earlier date than conventional history talks about. But do you think it goes back further than that, beyond the Ice Age? Or lost civilizations, that kind of thing?
I deliberately don't mention Atlantis in the book, because I deliberately want to stay with established research, because I think there's enough of an amazing story to tell, even if you just stay very, very grounded in that respect. One of the things I think would show up an awful lot more lines of inquiry is DNA analysis. And I don't know if any of you are familiar with the work of Lloyd Pye, for example. I think his stuff is kind of interesting. I mean, there is this whole, what happens when Cro-Magnon appears at 45,000 BC, and this change from having slopey foreheads and not being able to speak, to having vertical faces and high brows, and being able to speak. Lloyd Pye is talking about that. I've met Michael Tellinger, and I'm familiar with his slave species of God theories. It's possible that we were modified. I think what's also very interesting is this whole thing to do with the blue-eyed, blonde-haired gene. And as far as I know, some Scandinavian researchers have identified that as originating somewhere near the Black Sea. So that's kind of interesting. But the date they give is around 6,000 BC, so I'm not sure if that corroborates. I mean, I find it very, very fascinating the way people have such an emotional attachment to Celts, for example. People are always really keen to say Celtic this and Celtic that. And people seem to imply that Celts built Stonehenge or whatever. My thinking about that is that it's possible that when they were all in the original homeland, certain of the tribes had more contact with the civilizers than others, and it's possible that the Greeks and the Celts had the most contact, which is why their interpretations of civilization were more positive and benign, and we resonate better with them. It's also a fact that you may not be aware of, but the ancient Greeks were also very blonde-haired and blue-eyed, and you can see the legacy of that in Afghanistan. Because Alexander the Great, he fights these huge campaigns all across through Turkey and Iran into Afghanistan and then down into the Indus Valley. And there is a genetic legacy left behind in Afghanistan, these extraordinary girls in particular with green eyes and things who relate to him. So the blonde-haired, blue-eyed thing is very interesting. When I was doing my research, I did try to see if I could find some things you could pin the Atlantis thing on, and I just find that really difficult. I mean, maybe the Sphinx does relate to that earlier time, and that they were returned. Yeah.
I just wanted to ask, we were talking outside actually about older civilisations, and I just wondered what you thought about before the end of the last Ice Age, places like Varka, where they found this city under the water. And also Yonaguni, where there's this huge...
Oh, it's in Japan?
Yes.
The Graham Hancock stuff. Yes, but that could also... You remember I talked about that huge environmental catastrophe at the end of the 4th millennium BC. That could be the time when those cities were submerged. My own personal view is that this whole business about what they were doing in mountains, why they were... I go back perhaps and... back to the maps, why they were, this map probably does it, why they were up here and why the earliest pottery and metalwork and all the rest of it happens, particularly around Mount Nimrod in particular. There was a culture called the Halafians, and you can see their pottery in the British Museum. It's really beautiful. It's before they use wheels to make pottery. It's beautiful handmade stuff. It's very, very fine, and there was a whole series of these. Truthjuice is a place. It's here. It's not quite as old as Göbekli Tepe. I don't want to talk about Göbekli Tepe because I haven't fully understood what Göbekli Tepe is all about. But Truthjuice was part of a whole series of settlements. And what was interesting about those settlements was that the storerooms were better built than the houses around them. And so what I think is that the elites used the locals to create these storage areas to support operations in the mountains. And but they didn't. So that's why they didn't build cities. They didn't need to, because obviously the cities were somewhere else. But where they were, I don't know. I mean, that's open to interpretation. But I think that explains why you have things like the Halafian culture with these, and I call them emporia in my book, this whole chain of places like Truthjuice.
In the expanding earth theory, if there was a catastrophe and if waters were coming, the safest place to go would be up into the mountains?
Not necessarily, because what happened in that catastrophe of the 4th millennium BC was that you had this extraordinary phenomenon of raised beaches and instantly submerged forests that happened in opposite quarters of the world. So what you actually had was a line of neutrality around the world where nothing happened. So it's quartered the impact. And Egypt, interestingly enough, is on this line of neutrality. And so is the Scandinavia. So that's why they perhaps went back to Egypt, because they felt... Yeah. I mean, the Celts continued even until the time of Alexander the Great. The Celts still had a thing where they talk about the earth, the sky falling on their heads. They had some oath that they used to say. So some very long... One of the things that amazed me about my research when I was doing it was realising that things stayed unchanged for such a long time. You know, once something could happen. And also I talk about how the earlier stuff is often the best stuff, because that's when they're being taught by the elites, and then the quality deteriorates after that. It's kind of really odd. Well, they just stopped knowing how to do it properly, because the elites had given up and moved on. Yes?
Did you just research all this stuff for your book, or do you have an academic background? I mean, you sound as though you know a lot about all these things. A lot of it was, going over my head. I was trying to, remember all the various facts and things.
What started me on it?
Yeah. I mean, what's your background?
Well, my background is I grew up in the university town of Cambridge, where I've got lots of ancestors. I've even got one ancestor who in the 19th century held the same chair of Lucasian mathematics as Isaac Newton and Stephen Hawking, but I don't think genetically I've benefited because my maths is hopeless, so I'm a bit crossbow now. Anyway, so I grew up knowing that you need very high standards of reference, very high standards of proof. I didn't actually go to Cambridge University, I couldn't be bothered. My sister did, she went to the College of Boston Road. I went to Sussex University and I read international relations and Italian. International relations is a degree that covers a wide variety of subjects: economic international relations, political relations, philosophy, the whole. I wanted to read PP at Oxford, that's what I really wanted to do. So I've always been interested in very wide-ranging things. But what started me on this book was actually an interest in alternative medicine, because when my youngest daughter was a baby, I started to get really interested in homeopathy. And so my children are not vaccinated, for example, and they've travelled all over Egypt, India, all sorts of places. And I hated the fact that I consider myself to be a reasonably rational, reasonably well-educated person. I hated the fact that my GP friends dismiss homeopathy as unscientific. So I thought if I go back to the origins, if I go back to what the Greeks did, I might find out a different story and be able to say to them, well, look, this is why you think what you do. And at that point, I didn't know much about Egypt. And the more I dug around, the more I realised there's just this huge story that's just out there waiting to be told. So it took me 10 years. But you can be forgiven. I mean, I didn't know any of it before I started.
It was very condensed, the talk was condensed.
Yeah. Well, the thing is my book, my talk, and I give other talks too on different aspects of this. It's really just to try and fit in your minds this vast stretch of time, but to see these connections and to give you, because it's so easy to fall into a trap of thinking that the negative things are all deliberate and that cities are kind of, it's a negative thing, because we're very dominated by the whole Roman Greek experience, especially the Roman experience. And so I think we forget to look beyond it. We forget to look what the origins of it are. Because the Egyptians were a closed book. Until the Rosetta Stone in the 19th century, we didn't really understand Egypt at all. And I think we're even now only slowly getting into grips with it as it is. So that's perhaps why.
Have you looked at places like, is it Namrut Dagi, just in Turkey, just coming across from Göbekli Tepe?
Nemrut Dag?
Yeah.
That's Mount Nimrod.
Oh, is that what it is?
Yeah, it's the Turkish way of saying Mount
Because you have these weird, sort of mythological tales that sort of hang around that whole area from the Nile and Crete to the south of Turkey.
Yes, well, I mean, Turkey's it's very interesting. I mean, it's also, I suppose, I don't know quite where the Commodore is. I think it must be more central. Nemrut Dag, that's there. That's Mount Nimrod. There's Commodore, is where the Chaldean Magi were living in the remains of the Hittite Empire. Another reason for thinking that this here is the city of Abraham rather than down here is that he deals with the Hittites who are up here. He doesn't deal with them down in Mesopotamia. My sort of thinking is that when the Greeks and Romans came down through the Caucasus, this could be the land of Colchis, the place of Jason and the Argonauts and the Golden Fleece. And it's possible that there was an Egyptian outpost here, and that Troy was part of a route through, because it was known for a particular kind of crocus that was helped to relieve gout. And my personal feeling is that maybe the Egyptians made contact with the Greeks at that point and used them as mercenaries and brought them further around, because there were a lot of Greek tribes living in Turkey before they actually moved into Greece. So yeah, I mean, it's a fascinating place, as you say. I found some very interesting connections between some of those Greek legends with tales along the Silk Road, the Turkic stuff to do with different shapes of bows and things like that. That some of these stories come from much further east.
Yeah, it's
very
weird,
curious translations
the Greeks didn't really have any shamanic chemicals, whereas obviously the Egyptians did with the Blue Lotus and other things. So you had this, and obviously you had the Siberians travelling with the Amanita muscaria and all that sort of thing, but the Greeks didn't have that, so I don't know where they got the creativity from, unless it was fed from a...
Well, that's why I say they learned what they learned from the Egyptians. And this is something that we don't acknowledge. We don't acknowledge that Pythagoras spent 22 years in an Egyptian temple. We just say, oh, it all starts with the Greeks. No, you open any standard textbook and also it starts with the Greeks. And clearly it doesn't.
We read algebra or the sort of like the mathematics coming from the Arabic side.
Well, that's much later, of course. And I worked out an interesting thing to do with chess. I worked out what checkmate means. I have a friend who's an Algerian friend, so and it works better in French. Checkmate is checkmate, but what it means is to do check means shake, as in king, and mart, as in the feather of Mart, the kingdom of death. So that's what checkmate means, because it doesn't make any sense if you think about it in English. But if you translate it into French, checkmate, you translate it into Arabic.
What means harmony and balance?
Mart is the feather of truth. It's to do with Well, she's also, because she's in that hall of judgment, where
It should be what the queen is onto the chest to be defended.
No, when you have checkmate and the game is over, you know, there's effectively the death. The word checkmate in English makes no sense at all, but if you translate it and put it back into Arabic, then you can see it relates to the sheikh as in king and mart as in the feather of truth, and to do with the sort of kingdom of death kind of thing. I was just kind of curious aside there, showing the link between chess and all that Arabic stuff.
Now, around numerous tea urns tomorrow, we'll be able to drop that in. Just an inconsequential aside. You know what checkmate means, don't you?
Well, one of the things I probably ought to talk to you about a little bit is the whole thing to do with monotheistic religion, because that's one of the things that fascinated me. I write about it in the book. And the links between the Egyptian pharaoh Akhenaten and the Hebrews, the Jewish tribes, because we're given the impression that Abraham and his families were these heroic torchbearers with this idea of one God, and they're going across the desert to go and put the Egyptians out of their misery and correct them in the errors of their ways. Whereas actually the truth of it probably is more that there were these groups of people called the Hyksos who arrived in Egypt because there were some catastrophe and famine, and these Hyksos, they invaded Egypt effectively and took over the country for a bit, and amongst the Hyksos were these people called the Habiroos, and the Habiroos, which means Hebrews, means people from the other side of the river. And what that relates to is the fact that these Habiroos were mixed up with the Hyksos at that place Mari that I showed you in that trade thing. And because at this point, Mari is the other side of the river to where these people originated from, which is the land of the Mitanni, which is up. So Mari is here, Egypt's down here, and the land of the Mitanni is up here. And that the Hebrews actually originated from up there, the other side of the Euphrates. And that they actually were polytheist believers. They had believed in many gods, it even says so in the Bible. And that their whole idea of one God was actually something they were introduced to by Akhenaten, because he developed this whole concept of the Aten, the power behind the sun. And that's what he closed all the temples down, he stopped the Assyrian rites, and he wanted just this one monotheistic concept. And then these various different Habiroos became very high-level servants of his. They worked in his royal household and became his priests and so forth. Not just Joseph, he was one of them. There were other people like the Pineus family, who are these high-ranking Levites. And it's possible that there was then some political upheaval. Akhenaten was deposed, and the Moses, meaning son of, whoever he was, Freud thought that Moses was actually Akhenaten himself, but I'm not sure. It could have been a brother to Tutankhamun. He then led the Habiru out of Egypt, and they eventually arrived in Israel. But there may well have been one group of Jewish people who got left behind, who didn't leave at the time of the Exodus. And this could have been a strange group of Jewish believers who got stuck on Elephantine Island, which is in the upper Nile near Aswan. And these people, as late as the 6th century BC, when the Persians invaded Egypt, were still there, and they had no rituals to do with the Exodus. They had no belief in Purim and things like this. And I think that it's possible that those people went on to become the Essenes, and they were later arrivals in Israel, in Palestine, at Qumran on the Dead Sea, and that the whole Hebrew Jewish thing descends from Akhenaten. It's just not acknowledged, and the Essenes thought of themselves as the most orthodox and the closest to Akhenaten. If any of you come across Robert Feather's book, The Copper Scroll Decoded, which is one of the scrolls discovered at Qumran, he makes a very compelling case for saying that it talks about an itinerary of a list of treasure, and nobody's ever found the treasure in Jerusalem because they're all searching in the wrong place, because this temple where this treasure is described actually probably more likely relates to Akhetaten, the city of Akhenaten. and they have found gold that actually matches up in weights and everything to what's described in this copper scroll list. It actually is an established thing there. And so it's possible that the Essenes, who wrote the copper scroll, considered themselves to be even more orthodox than the other Jewish tribes, and so were they were very, very anti the Romans. And I think that the whole St. Paul thing happens because the the temple in Jerusalem is very worried that having these very aggressive, highly orthodox zealot Essenes at Qumran is going to bring the wrath of Rome down upon the temple in Jerusalem. So they dispatched Saul off to Damascus. Is possibly a code word for Qumran. It wasn't actually going to Damascus in Syria. He was actually going to Qumran, because if you read the different Dead Sea Scrolls, you can see they have all these code names, and Damascus is one of them. And while he's there, instead of persuading them to stop, he actually joins their community. And there's a thing in the Copper Scrolls, not the Copper Scrolls, the Dead Sea Scrolls, where it talks about three things: a liar, betrayer, the priest that's killed, and so forth. And what the Jesuits who've been translating the Dead Sea Scrolls have done is place all this back into a much earlier historic time, because they don't like the fact that it could interfere with their interpretation of how Christianity came about. But actually it probably relates to Paul, and he's described as a liar and a betrayer, because having joined their community, he then pinches all their ideas and goes off and sets up his own communities, and of course they don't like that. And they do invite the wrath of the Romans down, and the Romans do destroy the temple in Jerusalem in AD 66. And Paul goes off and sets up his own things. So there's kind of very curious origins to do with monotheism that are not really talked about, especially that whole Egyptian-Hebrew combination. People, they skate over all these sort of things, and the Bible is just somebody's different groups of interpretation. It's not necessarily a historic fact. Does that kind of press anybody's buttons, or make any sense?
Is there an inference then that sort of Moses is one of the Egyptian royal bloodline?
Yes, exactly.
And he leads some Ashkenazi or some group of...
Yes. Yeah, I mean, you see, Moses, the Moz means son of. So it's just an epithet, it's just a title. So who he actually was, and it clearly says in the Bible that he was a royal Egyptian prince. So whether he was the rightful son of Akhenaten and in this political upheaval, because after Akhenaten is deposed and there's this whole upheaval, his city of Akhetaten is destroyed, it's eliminated, and the Assyrians come back. I think Akhenaten discovered politics by trying to centralise everything and trying to make this one god problem. Whereas before, with different temples being the principal places where different deities were, you had things in balance, no one is more powerful than the other. I think in trying to centralise it and focus it on the art, and he created a political problem for himself. And his legacy stayed on with the Jewish tribes, but not in Egypt. Another writer who's really interesting is Ahmed Osman. He writes, he gives some really interesting stories to do with, he says that David and Solomon were actually Egyptian pharaohs, and that David Tutmosis III, because he says in these languages without vowels, David can be dwud, can be twut, can be twut, can be tut, as in Tutmosis. Tutmosis means son of Thoth. And that Solomon is actually Amenhotep IV, because Solomon is another epithet meaning peaceful, because he's a diplomat and is wanting to have these treaties of peace. And that what Ahmed Osman says is that the reason why they haven't found the Temple of Solomon is because they're looking in the wrong place, because the Temple of Solomon is actually part of Amenhotep's Hebsed festival court at Luxor. So it's not even in Israel, it's actually in Egypt, and it talks in about the Temple of Solomon having the forest of, I can't remember the exact phrase, but something like the forest of Lebanon or whatever, these massive trees. And there in his temple at Luxor, there is remains of these huge tree trunks, the cedars of Lebanon that the Phoenicians would have brought for him. So this is why it's been a completely futile exercise looking for the Temple of Solomon, because they were looking in the wrong place. And also I want to say that jumping many centuries, because the Knights Templar also went looking for the Temple of Solomon, is that I personally subscribe to the view that the Templars changed into the Freemasons, and that the Freemasons, I think, did a lot to keep knowledge alive, and they were persecuted by the church. And one reason why people are so negative about Freemasonry today is I think they just continue the propaganda of the church, which is very anti-Freemasonry. So I don't know if that's controversial enough. But that's my personal view. Yes?
So you talk about the elite and the secret knowledge they have that.
Yeah.
So in your opinion, so obviously you're only really talking about things that you can reference, but in your opinion, who were they and where did they come from?
Or where did they go to? Or
where did they come from?
Where did they come from?
This knowledge?
Well, the people. Well, at this event that we held in April, my place in Suffolk, I had Brian Forster come over from Peru, because he's done a lot of work. He also spoke at Megalomania as well, because he's done a lot of work on the elongated skull stuff. And there's plenty of evidence that there are people with these extraordinary skulls all over where this ancient knowledge is. And I don't know. I think there's more to be said about the DNA, the Lloyd type work.
It ties into crystal skulls as well, doesn't it? This
a bit, yeah.
People being able to impart knowledge into crystal skulls and pass them down.
Yes.
It's always the NFT with the elongated skull.
Yeah, but the Akhenaten thing is strange, because if you look at the beautiful bust of Nefertiti that exists in the museum in Berlin, she's not deformed in that same way. And so when you go and look at Akhenaten stuff in Luxor or wherever, it just looks like a stylized art form rather than that's actually how they actually were.
Well,
you see what I mean?
I thought when he came in, he says that that people all the artwork changed, and they said you're not allowed to lie anymore, and so the artwork had to be painted as it is.
I don't know, because they're very, very weird, and it's only during the time of Akhenaten. All the other pharaohs are completely new.
That's why I'm asking you what you think about him, because in what I've studied, he wasn't genetically the same, that he was an ascended master that came to reunite humanity into the Christ conscious grid of one God, instead of the duality, and that's why he had an elongated skull, and she did, and their children. Yeah,
it's possible. Well, one of those skulls that one of those images I put up at the beginning, I think it's Tutankhamun's X-ray of his head, and you can see it's very strangely longer. It's possible. I mean, it's quite often the case that things start off with very good intentions, turn really nasty. You know, look at the French Revolution. I mean, that started off with very good intentions, and then all sorts of people died innocently. So it's possible that Akhenaten did start off with a very good idea, but it just went wrong, because the problem for me of this whole monotheistic thing is that it's too easy to justify the ends justify the means. It's too easy to do that, blowing people up in the name of Allah, or torturing them on a rack for the sake of their eternal soul, or whatever. And if you take a different way of looking at it, where everything is interconnected, then you don't get that kind of cruelty.
So that's what they did. They took a part and kept the rest of it kind of like to themselves, the spirituality side, and just fed them. See what you just did.
How do you mean?
Basically, they stole the knowledge.
Who stole the knowledge?
Well, the Europeans, the Romans, the Greeks.
Well, I don't think they did, because I don't think they got to the knowledge, you see. I think the knowledge, because you needed to be trained, you needed to be initiated. And no, I don't agree. I really don't think they actually ever got to it. I think that and even if you were to open up the Vatican, the library in the Vatican, you might find all sorts of magical books and whatever, but unless you know the codes, unless you know the keys, unless you know how to unlock all that, you can have as much. Yeah, you can have as much knowledge as you like, but you may be none the wiser. You see, I don't think that this is part of the problem, is that we think that they have more knowledge than they do, because things are not going that well for us.
And the way that they teach in the school, like you said, they teach you that whoever the academics are, that took the knowledge and the maths and whatnot, but really and truly it was all just stolen knowledge, and it went all over the earth.
Yeah, I don't know if it's necessarily stolen. I mean, the thing is, things.
Well, it was actually given as well. There's times when it was given and it was passed on because that's what it's supposed to be doing. But like manipulated it and used it for their own benefits.
Yeah, that's certainly true. But the thing is that I think there's still huge gaps there where I don't think that elites do actually. I think we give them more credit. I think we assume they know more than they actually do, and that a lot of what is taught in universities and schools these days is because we know no different. And the Egyptians talk about this. They tell the Greeks, your children. You know, there have been many times when catastrophes have happened and knowledge has been lost. The Egyptians were very aware of very long cycles of time, and I think that's why there's certain aspects of this knowledge, like this whole shamanic thing, like the role of the pharaohs. We just don't know about it. You know, what I've done here, as I was saying to you, is I've tried to be like a forensic detective. You know, you don't know who's murdered that person, but you take this bit of evidence and that bit of evidence, and you kind of piece it all together and just see what gives. And so that I'm putting together a plausible interpretation of what I think based on the evidence. And from my own personal experience, of my own life experiences of where I've worked and studied and people I know and all the rest of it, I don't get any sense of elites being incredibly knowledgeable. I don't get any sense of that. I get a sense of incredible ignorance.
Where it shows,
is that also to a level of
and there's no centralised elite either. That's the other thing.
Where it shows up, I think, is it when you get practices like Bohemian Grove, where a lot of the elite meet to set fire to an owl and bring a woman down. If you look at some of the shamanistic principles from the Amazon, if you subvert the process, if you don't follow the cleansing and the right intention, you're subverted by the negative energy. That means you can't produce lead from gold, or gold from lead, because you can't be ascended, because your intention is coerced, and therefore you're dragged into the reverse, the occult side. So therefore the elite are always looking for enlightenment.
Well, you have to remember that occult just means hidden. Hidden, yeah. It doesn't necessarily mean dark. It doesn't necessarily mean negative.
If you read the canon, the ecclesiastical canon, it actually says that in there, in so many words, that they made a one religion for us, and they actually worship Saturn. Which was Satan. What was it? Saturn, there's three different things, and Jupiter was the Sun, Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. Father was Saturn, Jupiter was the Sun, and the Holy Ghost, I think, was Stella I think it's connected to the earth or something like that. And that is actually in the law of canons.
Yeah.
So that they've got this.
There's no doubt about it that there are some negative groups. I'm not saying they're not. There's no doubt about that. I'm just saying that they're not unified. There's no overall negative group that controls and manipulates. But what you can see by looking at the historic record and going, this is why it interests me to go beyond Greeks and Romans, to scrape all that Iron Age stuff away, and get back to something else. That's what interests me, because then you can see something that's actually positive and not a negative. You know, I really do believe that the Hermetica is a very positive philosophy in that, and that the whole original thing had good things to do with it. And yes, there's no doubt about it. Corruption, greed, and all this, these things can be subverted and taken in a bad direction. And that's why why were the Romans so obsessed with persecuting knowledge? I don't understand that.
I think they were OCD. They like lists.
Well, possibly, yeah.
They done the old list of England, you know, Doomsday Book, and they went all around Europe and just basically said, let's commercialise stuff.
Yeah, but I mean, this I'm talking about, like, you know, the 1st century BC or earlier. Why?
That would explain why they're attacking the esoteric knowledge.
Exactly. That's why I don't, you know.
Because maybe they want to get credit for it.
I don't think they want
No, because they actually wanted to destroy it. They actually wanted to get rid of it.
If they take what they want from it and destroy the rest, then they, because they're conquerors anyway, they want history, and then they can interpret it whenever they want.
The Romans weren't monotheistic all the time, were they? Because in England, the Romans weren't monotheistic early on in their occupation.
No,
in England, they allowed you to celebrate Osiris, Trinity, pagan. It was only later emperors that started to say,
but it's during that time when they still had those polytheistic beliefs that they throw the Pythagoreans out of Italy, that they ban alchemy. That this is what interests me, that they attack the Chaldean Magi. You know, and they invade England to attack the Druids.
Yeah, they closed down early Truthjuice movement.
Well, there you go. Absolutely. They're on your case. You know, even then they're on your case. So I don't. Yes, I mean you're probably right that there are some elements of wanting to take something from it and get rid of it. Yeah.
Have you heard about the stuff of the Egyptians being connected to Ireland? And Troy, the Troy with Earth.
Yeah.
Apparently it was common knowledge that we all came from Troy or something, apparently, until they discarded it from histories, which is sort of...
Yeah, and the tribes of Dan and things like that, the Tuatha didn't. I mean, the difficulty that I have is in separating out legend and myth from what you can see in the record. So yes, I mean, it's quite possible there are these curious links, and there's supposed to be the idea of Scotta, isn't there, the daughter, who the Egyptian princess.
And the astrology of the stone circles, you know, some of them line up with Venus in a certain age, several thousand years.
Yeah. Well, a really interesting book is that Uriel's Machine book, where they talk about, that's when passage graves in particular come into existence, because what they call a collimator, where it's a great long tunnel thing. They're not actually graves at all, but they're a way of focusing starlight and things so that you can calibrate calendars between particularly the 8 and 5 years of Venus and the Moon and the Sun to calibrate. Because after that huge wobble at the end of the 4th millennium BC, it's possibly the explanation for that that circle, that spiral, because it's a 3.5 turn spiral. And the mutation lasted for 7 years, so it's a way of marking where you were on the wobble. So it's not actually decoration, it's actually... Because I often think that things that we think are just decoration or ritualistic or fetish actually have a practical purpose, and that, so you could recalibrate the calendars. There's this idea that somewhere like Skara Brae up in the Orkneys was just like this ancient place, a bit like we use the observatory in Hawaii as an outpost. Because what they worked out there was that the carcasses that they found in the Midlands, in the rubbish heaps, don't add up to whole animals, which suggests that stuff was shipped in for these people, so that it's like a little outpost that and Skara Brae is like sort of Fred Flintstone's ideal little stone house kind of setup. It's got furniture made out of stone, as it were. So and an incredible heat that's cracked the stones that nobody can, because the I think there were no trees at that point, and the peat that comes later is from a much later time. So there's some very curious anomalies to do with Skara Brae up in the north. I haven't totally understood myself what the difference between the incredible megaliths and the incredible precision of the city stone builders and the rough stuff of the megaliths in Western Europe. I haven't understood why there is that difference. Clearly some of the same techniques were used. They clearly knew how to move these things. I mean, the Preseli Mountain is where some of the Stonehenge stones come from in Wales. That's a huge distance, and these things were very, very heavy. And they also built Stonehenge. It was built on the site of a much older place with wood. They used timber before the stone circle. And they built it in the style of a timber construction, because it has a mortise and tenon feature in cutting the stone. So that's a curious thing that they're kind of replicating in a difficult medium. So there's all sorts of strange anomalies to be worked out. One thing I want to leave you with is another book, changing the subject, going back to this religion thing in a way. There's a book by a woman called Elizabeth H, and that's spelled H-A-I-C-H, and it's called Initiation. I don't actually refer to it in my book because it's a channel of life, it's a past life remembered, but it's absolutely fascinating. It's about that thick, and she goes into incredible detail of what she remembers about being initiated into the priesthood in Egypt in ancient times. And it's really, really dense. It's full of enormous philosophy and everything, and I couldn't recommend it more highly. I was telling you about it when you were talking about focusing meditation on things, because she talks about exactly the same techniques that they were doing in the temple.
What's the name of that one?
It's called Initiation, and she's called Elizabeth H, and it's spelled H-A-I-C-H.
Corroboration of it.
Well, it's very difficult, isn't it? Because that's why I don't quote it in my book, because how do you corroborate? But it just makes a lot of sense. It just resonates so powerfully.
We have to come to an end, unfortunately. For yourself, thanks for coming. Thank you very much. I always know you're going to